During this panel, you will have the chance to dive deeper into the threats facing the U.S. industrial base during global competition. In this panel, we have Heather Richmond, founder at the Defense Investor Network, Gene Suchodowski, Director of Innovation Protection Policies for the United States Navy, Office of Naval Research, Captain Colin Supko, Director at the Trusted Capital. Now, I met Colin a few times when I was teaching at the Naval Academy years ago. However, his older brother Mike was my plebe summer squad leader. I owed the Supko family a lot. Good to see you here, Captain. And Andrea Carpenter, Fit Deputy at the United States Navy. Welcome to the stage. Please take it away.
Awesome, Brian. Thank you so much for having us. We have a great group today, and I'm really excited for this discussion. My name is Heather Richmond. I'm based here in Palo Alto, California. I'm part of BM&T and founder of the Defense Investor Network, which is a trusted ecosystem of investors that are national security minded. Colin, go for it. Introduce yourself.
Well, thanks for that great introduction. I don't hold a candle to my brother, but I'm fortunate to be here. So I spent some time in the Navy. Spent some time out in the Valley as an entrepreneur, and now I am the DoD's director of the Trusted Capital Program, living here in Capitol Hill in Washington, D.C. It's such an honor to be with this amazing group of panelists. So, over.
Andrea.
Hi, this is Andrea Carpenter. I'm currently in a rotational position over at the Assistant Secretary of the Navy for Research, Development, and Acquisition, and my home command is the Naval Sea Systems Command.
Awesome. And Jane, welcome.
Thank you, Heather. Yes, as mentioned in that kind introduction, I'm currently serving as the Director of Innovation Protection Policies for the U.S. Navy. And in that role, my job is to identify and anticipate emerging technologies and emerging innovations and the risks and opportunities those might present to the DoD, as well as to develop initiatives that protect and help advance our own industrial base.
Awesome. I know, Gene, you're going to kind of start us off with a big picture, kind of a big picture viewpoint. You want to go ahead and get started?
Yeah, sure. So the title of this presentation is The Cost of Not Pivoting, which begs a couple questions. Pivot to what and for what purpose? And so the way the panel is structured today, we're going to start out with some really big picture kind of issues and things. And then as we work our way through the panel, we'll narrow that down to a little more pragmatic focus. And hopefully you'll learn a little bit about what kinds of big picture issues we're worried about and some of the initiatives the DoD and the Navy in particular may be taking to address those particular issues. So next slide, please. So innovation. So let's start with defining what we mean by innovation. That is that process of taking novel ideas and converting them into commercial applications ready for use by others. And innovation has formed a major portion of growth and economic stability in our economy starting since the Civil War. The United States has had the largest economy in the world since the Civil War. And for much of the 20th century, the contribution to that economy from innovation has been greater than 50 to 60%. In some decades, as much as 70%. In the 21st century, we've seen a little bit less of a contribution from innovation to the overall growth of the economy, but still a major contributor. And so innovation is a major driver of our standard of living and our economic stability and our economic competitiveness in the world. And so it's valuable to preserve and protect that innovation ecosystem for at least those reasons. But also, our military depends on innovation and technological superiority for its fighting strength, its agility, its ability to protect power in the world. And so for that reason, innovation is also a key driver of our national security, both from an economic stability perspective, as well as having an advanced and capable military. Well, other nation states have also recognized that about ourselves And after the Cold War and the Gulf War in particular, a number of them actually wrote major doctrines and treatises that looked at that, about our own economy and our own stability as a military and a nation. And so they have actually engaged in strategies and executed doctrines that look to appropriate that innovation system for themselves, for their own purposes, but also to weaken it as a source of maybe influencing their own agendas in the world and making our ability to influence world agendas less pronounced. And so in 2018, in fact, there was a major paper written by the Defense Innovation Unit that looked exactly at the types of things some nation states were doing to try to appropriate our own innovation ecosystem for themselves. And what's important to note about that is many of those techniques were actually not illegal. They were actually legal things that you can do in our economy. And so that's been an emerging trend we've seen with many nation states trying to attack, or not attack, but to focus on our innovation ecosystem as a target of opportunity for themselves and their own agendas. So next slide, please. So our innovation ecosystem is our strength, but also an Achilles heel. And so that discussion is partly a way to explain pivoting for what purpose. And now I'd like to talk a little bit to what end? What can we do? What kinds of things might we be pivoting towards or thinking about? And so here we have a standard technology S-curve, which I'm sure many in the audience may already be familiar with, but for those who may not, this is a standard growth curve for how technology gets introduced and adopted into society. And so at the beginning, we have this emerging technology phase, and there's a lot of chaos, so we don't know which technologies are going to emerge as a thing. And that's followed by a growth stage where those technologies get adopted as innovations and used either commercially or in other non-commercial applications, but they get deployed out into our universe of things we can use and acquire and for ourselves. And in this phase, companies are mostly competing on their ability to provide quick and new and novel technology solutions. So we're not competing on price so much in this phase. And then we get to a mature phase where technologies start to age out and become obsolete. And we start to compete in this moment more on price. Things start to become commodities. And what happens here is that we get a collapse of the supply base as industries kind of consolidate. And that presents its own unique supply chain risks. But if we look at the emergent phase and we look at the growth phase, you can see there's kind of an inflection point where it goes from concave to convex on that curve. And the point I want to make to you about this slide, especially in my role and some of what the panelists are going to talk to you about later, is if you don't have a position in that early stage of that curve, it becomes really hard to regain it or influence how that technology gets deployed in your society later. Once you get past that inflection point, it takes major events like big mergers and acquisitions, major legislation or policy shifts to tilt and orient that maybe in a direction that's more preferable to your own economy or your own ecosystem. So all of you who are participating in emergent technologies aren't just contributing new innovations to us all, but you're also helping us manage all of those issues I talked about earlier. And it's very important that we win these foot races. So what are we kind of doing about that? Well, there are a variety of things that the Navy is doing. We've learned probably some of those. You're going to learn more about them today. Naval X and all of those tech bridge efforts that you may have heard about already and are going to explore in later conversations. Other initiatives by other services to access technology early and to bring it into our ecosystem. Today, I'm speaking to you from the MAC, the Mission Acceleration Center in downtown Seattle. And the MAC is a multi-agency, multi-DoD agency, multi-government agency effort to collaborate with the technology ecosystem here in the Puget Sound to enable our warfighters to seek solutions from non-traditional partners for their needs and problems, but also to help emerging companies and new companies better integrate and figure out how to work with the DoD. So that concludes my brief remarks for today's panel. And now I'd like to turn it over to the other panelists so they can talk about how they're pivoting in the face of these emerging challenges and opportunities. Andrea?
Thanks, Jean. So hi, everyone. Andrea Carpenter again. So Jean did a great job of scene setting for us, basically, and just how important the innovation and these new technologies and new companies and ventures are to the Department of the Navy. More and more we're seeing these dual-use technologies, robotics and artificial intelligence, and the line between what is commercial versus a Department of the Navy need is blurring, and so it's harder to kind of tell apart those things. So things like loss of technology and loss of IP, loss of market share, those are all like scary things to industry, but they're also scary to the Department of the Navy because we are seeing increasing targeted investments where foreign money, adversarial foreign money and influence is coming in and cutting off key supply chains or key, access points or influencing companies to make certain decisions. And then it's making it harder and harder for us to do business with companies or to, continue making progress and moving forward. So the focus that I'm going to be talking about today has more to do with that adversarial foreign capital and influence. And just to baseline, not all foreign investment is bad. I mean, foreign investment makes up a huge piece of the United States' GDP. We're an open market capitalistic society. It's just the nature of how we do business. But so I'm talking about specifically that subset of investments that we're seeing from, countries of concern. As an example, I think this underscores part of what Jean was talking about, with other nation states basically taking advantage of the systems that we have in place. China has very publicly stated that it's Made in China 2025 plan, where they're going to basically build their technology base and reduce their reliance on foreign produced technologies. So what does that mean? They're buying out a lot of technologies that we're interested in potentially. And I think the COVID-19 pandemic really highlighted to people just how interconnected and global our supply chains are, and just how difficult it is to know who's in your supply chain. And we're still dealing with the repercussions today. I mean, the semiconductor shortage is a great example of that. So right now, really the only statutory process that exists today to assess risks associated with this from a national security perspective is the Committee on Foreign Investment in the U.S., or CIFIUS. And this is an interagency group led by Treasury. And so there's a lot of different, it's 9 federal agencies with different, end goals at the end of the day, DoD's being national security. But it's a voluntary process and it has very limited jurisdictions. So at the end of the day, we're kind of left wanting some more proactive solutions and methodologies to assess these risks. And, events such as these and like Jean said, efforts like Naval X, where we're able to really start talking at the innovation level, are critical. Because by the time something hits CIFIUS, it's usually too late in the game, and then we're put in a reactive position. Really, we want to get to the point where we're protecting, key pieces of our supply chain and our innovation base before they're targeted. So last year, internally to the Navy, this Foreign Investment Tiger team was stood up really with the focus on, supply chain illumination, due diligence, and understanding the regulatory framework. It was sort of like a big baselining analysis of how do people do this now? You know, what's out there? And really the end goal of this effort is to develop capabilities to identify, mitigate, and monitor impacts. So we're focusing on some issue areas, again, really looking at processes, due diligence, supply chain illumination. And like I said, this engagement with industry is critical because we can talk to you about what we're concerned about, and we can hear from you, you know, what are realistic solutions and options for us moving forward. So then finally, you know, just to reiterate that, you know, this is not a trend. I think COVID woke a lot of people up, but over the past, you know, few years, we've been seeing more bipartisan support for, you know, executive orders and, you know, changes in how we do, you know, how we do business. And I think moving forward, the Department of the Navy is definitely going to be taking these risks into consideration as we make decisions. So I think my takeaway to you is that we want to make sure that we have, you know, a supply chain and investor capital that's clean. It's free of adversarial influence and money. And that's something that we're going to have to work together on. So I think I'm going to pass it over to Colin.
All right, just getting off of mute. Those were really two great briefs. I'm going to dive into something that it's really difficult, and that is the influence piece of foreign ownership control and influence. So we can look at capitalization tables and we can look at corporate records and understand who's sitting on boards, what voting rights they have on those boards, so on and so forth, to understand foreign ownership and control from a contractual perspective. But what's really, really hard to understand is influence. In how many ways does a friend of a friend have influence in some of the most important technology companies that we have? This happens more than people want to talk about because it's part of doing business. If you're not part of the national security space, you wouldn't think twice about helping one of your limited partners that's invested in your venture fund, helping his cousin meet the CEO of one of your portfolio companies. Because why? What's the problem there? I'm helping out somebody who is a part of our investment group, but it's not until we start to bring these things to the attention of folks that are not in the national security space to understand that unless you know who the ultimate beneficial owner is of a favor that you're providing or a investment that you're making, you really have a hard time understanding where's the influence and how is that influence impacting our national security apparatus. So with that, I'll turn it over to Heather. Heather's on mute.
I'm never on mute. Like, I'm always unmuted. So it's very unusual. Colin, thank you. And I'm going to actually kick it back to you for a second to dig in and talk a little bit about what you've been building the last number of months here within the DoD. I know a lot of the concerns that both Andre and Jean have outlined, you know, you've been tackling these and trying to figure out, you know, how do we actually mitigate? So my question is, you know, what are we doing to protect ourselves? Can you talk a little bit about what you've been working on?
Yeah, first, you know, my hat is off to Undersecretary of Defense for ANS and the industrial policy crew who took a chance on figuring out an innovative way to tackle this problem set. They allowed me to come in, create a strategy and build a minimum viable product, which was a market platform that conducted self-attested due diligence and then set a list of criteria for belonging to an open market in which technology companies could use their entrance into the market as a warm introduction to venture funds that had also gone through a due diligence process to be into the market. So this process, this program has been around almost 8 months. And in 8 months, we have 72 tech companies that have gone and been screened and confirmed to have made it past the criteria and been allowed into the market. We have 20 venture funds, so it's 92 companies. As an entrepreneur, I would say that we're moving up and to the right. We might not be quite at product market fit yet, but we're getting there. That should be an example of the fact that there is a want and a need out there in the marketplace for some involvement with the DoD to set some criteria that go beyond what CIFIUS and FIRMA and other legislation have laid into place. So the second thing that we are looking to bring to the forefront is the opportunity for a tours with industry program, which these tours exist within the Navy, within Office of Secretary of Defense. But in this instance, we're looking to send our DoD personnel for tours with industry programs with venture capital and private equity funds, so they can, one, help spot and assess new tech that's on the bleeding edge, and understand how the market, how the early stage innovation financial ecosystem does due diligence when making decisions on what are going to be the greatest technologies that are going to change both economic and national security moving forward. So thanks, Heather. I appreciate that opportunity.
Yeah, no, it's a great program, and I'm kind of moderating, but I'm going to talk for a second. So super, I mean, really great program. I think that something that Colin and I, and we've all been talking about is really this concept of trusted capital and what that looks like. And to Andrea's point, engaging with industry and figuring out, where, which companies, you kind of mentioned, it's more difficult to do business with some of these companies because of their cap tables and because of some of the funding that they've received. And so just kind of flipping it on its head a little bit and looking at this from the private side. So Colin, I love the program, and I'll say there's one more kind of unintended benefit probably. And the goal is to send some folks in there and actually educate the private capital community, educating the venture community, talking to, the private equity world, the hedge fund world. The amount of dollars that they are involved with is massive. And I think that, a lot for a while, it's been kind of ignorance is bliss, and there were a number of years, I'm based here in Palo Alto, and a number of years ago, it was kind of raining free money from certain countries of special concern. And if you weren't taking it, you were seen as kind of being out of the game. And Andrea, you mentioned, it was legal to do that. It still is legal to do that. So I think figuring out, I kind of want to kick it back to Gene and Andrea about, what can we do to protect ourselves more? Part of the goal of the Defense Investor Network has actually been to, instead of kind of sledgehammer with regulation, to actually, educate investors and turn. They're already patriots, but really make them aware of the true consequences and ramifications of adversarial capital. Because if you turn off the fire hose going into the companies at the investor level, it's going to be a heck of a lot easier than trying to go around to every single company that might be monopolized. But back to Andrea and Gene about just kind of what we can do to make ourselves more secure.
So I'll start. So a lot of what I think helps is just basic good early company hygiene. A lot of things are already in the law that you already need to comply with. And as you go from a beginning company to a more mature entity, these are just things that you need to be doing anyways. Good example of that is compliance with export control. That doesn't mean standing up a big operation about export control the way a major company would do, but just have somebody in your company who's the designated person who answers those questions or knows where to go seek additional help with answering those questions. Just designating somebody to do that. As Heather and Colin both mentioned, there's no law about knowing your investors, but just having some common sense and being diligent about that is also a big help. And then there's just basic corporate compliance types of things that not only helps with this problem, but makes you more attractive to investors. They show that you're well managed. They show that you've got basic tools and processes in place that help you comply with the law, but also address some of these issues. Managing your IP, designate somebody in your young firm who's the IP person. How are you protecting your trade secrets? What kind of patenting are you going to engage in? Have you budgeted for that? Those kinds of basic corporate management questions are often the best early prophylactic against some of the issues that we're talking about. Over.
Yeah, and just to add to that, Jean, I think we talk a lot about due diligence, and to dovetail what you were saying, knowing who is in our supply chain. We did an analysis earlier this year just to sort of see what is industry doing, and it was a small pool of primarily like the prime companies, but for the most part they're going down to the second and third tier of their supply chain. And, we know that the supply chain is far deeper than 3 tiers, but it's really hard to go past that, but we have to get better at doing that, both on the Navy side, but I think also, like Jean was saying, on the corporate management side of having more awareness of who's in our supply chain and where's our money coming from. So I think there's on both sides there.
Colin, you taking it? No? All right. So I guess one thing I'll mention really quickly with CIFIUS, there've been a couple of situations that I've become aware of through private capital investors, venture investors, about kind of percentages, how much adversarial capital can be in a company at this point, because there's a lot of talk right now about kind of unwinding some of the things that have been done that, again, were done not illegally. So that's definitely been a focus area of the private capital community. And just as you guys are thinking about, I want kind of our audience to be thinking about, there's the government response, of course, but there's also the private capital response, and they're desperately trying to do the right thing, most of them, not all. And so how can we encourage them? What sort of information can we provide them with? I know there's been a couple companies. I think the carrot for the companies anyway, and I think therefore for the investors, and actually there's a Navy company we're working with right now, but there have been companies that aren't eligible, or that certain potential customers inside of the DoD are uncomfortable, working with a certain company because of a percentage of ownership, on their cap table. And so I know that between potentially the service and then potentially the CIFIUS regulations and then potentially other agencies that will remain nameless, there's very different numbers being circulated. And I know there's a level of confusion in the investor community and also in the startup community around those sorts of things. And so any comments there? But I know that we have a question in the chat here. It says, question: more than 70% of AI patent applications are from China. One metric of innovation is the number of patents awarded. What should we do to accelerate the number of patent applications in such key areas?
Well, as the IP lawyer, I should probably start with that one. As the person asking the question probably knows, this is also a hot topic in the U.S. patent community, including whether inventions created by AI ought to be patentable or not. In the last decade, since the America Invents Acts, we've seen a real narrowing of what is patentable subject matter under 35 USC 101, which defines what's patentable. And so this is a big topic, a conversation. And I think no matter what your view, participating in those conversations is important. There was a big document that came out. It was a bipartisan study that came out last year that looked at patenting in AI and just how important it is to get patent positions in these key emerging technologies. And I can't speak for a government position here, of course, but I think whatever your position and belief is, it's important to be a participant in that conversation. I will say that generally, if you don't have statutorily protected IP, there's less options for you, and hence in the aggregate for society to protect that innovation and do things with it. So if you as a young company, emerging technology companies, if you don't have a patenting plan and a patenting program, I highly encourage you to develop one that meets your needs. Because when you have the asset, we have this concept called strategic openness. Just because you have a patent and a patent includes the right to exclude doesn't mean you have to exclude. But what it does give you the right to do is be strategic about how open you are with that technology, who gets to use it on what terms. But if you don't have that right to start with, then you don't have that option to be strategic. So going back to the question, I would say beyond the policy implications under 35 USC 101, I would just say to everybody out there who is in this space, who's a young company, develop your patenting plan, budget for it, and aggressively go after it, because it will give you business options later, and it will address the question, go behind the question that I think the questioner's getting to. Over.
Did it?
So I read the question a little bit differently. I read the question as somebody saying, hey, a metric of innovation is the number of patents being generated by said country. So that gets at a whole other problem within our early stage innovation ecosystem, within our some of our policies that have to do with immigration. This, although is a metric, as somebody who's worked in and around technology, I will tell you that there are plenty of companies who the last thing they want to do is try to patent their AI tech, because patents are publicly available information. So they consider those things, especially when it comes to software development, trade secrets. So we have to be really careful with tying patented information with being a good metric towards innovation. I'm not saying it shouldn't be one to consider, but there's plenty of other tech going on out there that has nothing to do with patents, because nobody wants, because one, patents are great within the United States, but in this global economic environment and corporate espionage and state cyber espionage, putting that information out is not always in a company's best interest. So
if I could pile onto that, Colin is getting at this tension that exists between whether a company keeps its intellectual assets as a trade secret protected form, or it uses patenting to protect those assets. That is going to really depend on the type of technology you have, what your business strategy is, etc. And my strong recommendation is really have an IP plan that includes making those decisions and allocating the necessary resources to one strategy or other. The downside risk of keeping something a trade secret is, of course, one, it's subject to reverse engineering, in which case you don't have any protection once that happened. Reverse engineering is entirely legal, and or you're relying on other forms of statutory protection like copyrights or trademarks or other statutorily protected forms, which may not be as strong. So the answer about whether patenting or trade secret is more important is really one of business strategy, and really the solution to that is really be clear and focused on what your company IP strategy is going to be. And to Colin's point about patents as a measure of innovation, totally agree. That is not necessarily the be-all and end-all measurement of who's out front innovating. It's one metric, but it's not the decisive one necessarily.
All right, so we're gonna take a little bit of a step back and just I like tactical information, and so it's I don't exactly know who's making up the audience, but I'm guessing we have some great entrepreneurs that are national security interested and minded. Obviously, we've got some investors out there, and then we've got kind of military service folks, and so there's three components to this, and I've given talks to AFRL and to other folks, and I keep getting questions from companies. How do I know? How do I what's out there for me to vet the investors, that are approaching me or that I'm approaching. And actually part of the Defense Investor Network conversation too is as more and more investors are getting used to this idea that this is a bad idea, how can you vet other investors that you might want to invest with? But what sorts of resources out there? I know it's tough, and it might be something that I know there's been, attempts at setting it up kind of inside OSD. I know, Colin, I know that your program is doing a lot of this, but how public can we make these sorts of things? How do we get that information out there so that companies can avoid this problem, go left of CIFIUS and avoid getting caught?
Yeah, I mean, my perspective is there is a place in the broader market for these consortiums of investors that will all agree to a certain set of criteria and adhere to that criteria and become better partners with the national security apparatus. I think there's absolutely a place for that. Just as there's a place for technology companies to belong to a consortium, whether they're doing business with the government or not, but understanding that, like I said, economic security, national security are not mutually exclusive. If this is for the group. If everybody has not read Kill Chain yet, you just need to stop what you're doing and go and read that book. That book is one of the best books that I've ever read about what's happened the past 30 years with respect to government innovation and platform-specific engineering that has and acquisition issues within our entire acquisition construct that really hasn't put us on a clear of footing as we otherwise might have been. And it gets after all these questions that Heather's talking about, in that we once had a amazing connective tissue between the national security apparatus and the early stage innovation ecosystem. We had people willing to assume risk. We had senior leaders, both political and industry leaders, willing to assume massive risk. And we have moved away from that. And that in itself, innovation and risk aversion are not synonymous. And that's something that we all need to be looking out for. And we, putting the white hat of the government on, we need the support of the broader markets to compete effectively in what's coming. Because what's coming is nothing like what it's been in the past 20 years of war. What's coming is nothing the likes of which the U.S. has ever faced in any of our lifetimes, or even the lifetimes of our parents. So it is space, it is quantum, it is cyber, it is autonomy, it is a whole new world. So over.
Yeah, and Colin, all those technologies you've mentioned, Gene and I have talked about the Internet of Things. I mean, it's a blurred line nowadays of what's very much a national security issue versus just an economic security issue. I always like to say it comes down to pretty much everyone having an iPhone in their pocket. Like those technologies are driving, just regular consumer products nowadays. So there's a much broader implication. And something we used to say, when the FIT was in full swing was, supply chain integrity. We have our, cost, budget, time, integrity should probably be part of that equation as well, as one of those variables that we look at.
Andrea, kind of facing on that and on CIFIUS, you mentioned it, voluntary process. I mean, where do you see this sort of legislation or sort of regulatory process? Where do you see these things going? I mean, do you see more teeth being put into it that's been talked about? Or do we need to, kind of talk about the integrity piece, with companies, with investors? That's something that we're doing out on the private sector side to try to mirror the conversations, coming from the DoD side. But where do you see this going?
So there's been a lot of focus on CIFIUS, and more. I mean, you can just Google, CIFIUS is popping up more in the news. Some cases are getting more attention. But CIFIUS is voluntary, and like I said, it has very limited jurisdiction. It really only covers certain types of investments. So there's a whole slew of stuff that doesn't meet the CIFIUS criteria. From a legislative perspective, I think just in the past 5 years, just with the changes that we've been seeing as part of the National Defense Authorization Act, the executive orders that have come out, the CHIPS Act has gotten a lot of attention, for semiconductor and protecting that industry. The Buy America Act has been beefed up a little bit. So I think that we're going to start seeing more and more of this type of language coming out of Congress, and it seems to have a lot of bipartisan support, which I think also points to it not really being a fad. This is definitely, I think the direction we're going is we're going to start slowly seeing more and more legislation, which then trickles down into regulations. So, and Jean can probably talk a little bit more about this too, from the types of analysis that she's done for us. But, I think from an industry perspective, everyone always wants to try to get ahead of regulation, right? So this is a really good opportunity, I think, for industry to really be proactive and kind of lean forward and try to figure out, we know what technologies are being targeted. We have a lot of, and we know what areas we're trying to protect.
Yeah, so just to follow up on what Andrea said, our regulatory framework right now is kind of a patchwork, and CIFIUS is kind of this drag, like gill net at the end that catches some things some of the time and when people participate in it. And so you, the audience, who is part of this ecosystem, is a big part of helping address and recognize these issues and respond to them. And so I touched a little bit on some voluntary things. I think some of the things short of regulation that we're tentatively investigating is perhaps just some voluntary self-certification or badging. So, if you're making electrical equipment, you're often trying to be UL compliant, right? So there may be some private sector things that can be put in place that also signal not only to the government, but to investors and to consumers or other business partners that, hey, you at least have some diligence in these areas. And so I think over the next couple months, we might be exploring with the private sector the possibility of some of those things. And in exchange, what would the private sector get? They might get, in addition to the reputational boost that might come from being able to say that you're compliant, there's also the opportunity to maybe get some economies of scale. So I mentioned earlier, having somebody who is tagged in your emerging company to know about export control. Well, great. I tag somebody. What are they supposed to do? So some of the things that a system like that might be able to provide is some help with standard things that might be made available to those people. So at a very basic level, you have a basic rudiment of how to comply with some of these or respond to some of these issues once you designate somebody. And again, some of these things are just basic good corporate hygiene, but when you're starting out, it can cost a lot of money in attorney's fees to try to figure out how to do them. So perhaps there's a way short of regulation where we can incentivize the behavior and there's a reward back to the community for doing so. So we'll probably be looking at some of those things over the next couple months. Over.
Gene, you're a genius. I couldn't agree more. The government has a few options, right? They can incentivize or disincentivize behavior in the market. If they're taking the laissez-faire approach, which most marketeers want, then the market's going to go do what's in the market's interest, which is not always in the best interest of the people of the United States. Mm-hmm. So I think I know we got to clear up pretty soon here. So this will be my last little bit. We're talking about very, very complex systems. We talk about an ecosystem that has so many variables. When we try to patchwork over just one of those variables, we're not altering the system. When that system has been studied for, half a century by our adversaries, where they know the system better than most of our bureaucrats know the system, then they can pick and choose where to insert themselves into that system to have the greatest impact. Which means that if we don't change the system, if we don't change the incentives and disincentives in that system, and we're just trying to follow where they're going and put up little blockers, we're never going to get ahead of the ballgame. So this goes to every person that's in the market, every bureaucrat that's out there listening to this. We need actual incentives and disincentives to change behavior in the market, and we need support from the market to understand that their long-term health and success is not decoupled from the country's national security capabilities. Over.
No, I think that's a great point. I mean, how as we're thinking about this, again, very tactically, you've got, Gene, I know we've talked about this, but I really like kind of the UL certification, similarly there as far as, it can be something that is industry initiated basically. And how do we, and to Colin's point, how do we encourage that kind of behavior rather than trying to, police or punish other behavior? I think kind of finding those incentives. And so I think the more that we're talking about it is really important. I think the more that we can create, certain tools, because we don't want to halt innovation. We actually need to start moving faster, not more slowly, but we're also trying to securitize and make sure that, these processes, we're being eyes wide open. We're taking care of, adversarial capital, but I think providing, to Jean, you mentioned, it's really difficult when you have a very small startup and you can tag somebody to look at those sorts of things, but they probably have 9 other jobs in a startup. And so, I think the more that I'll put it on the private sector, can create some of these tools and peer pressure each other a little bit into, acting in a patriotic way and acting in the best interest of our country. Colin, I like the way you kind of national security and economic security, go hand in hand more now than ever. And I think people are finally starting to open their eyes and realize it. It's 12:25, or in California it's 12:25. It's 2:25 out in Texas. But Jean, thank you so much. Thank you for kind of big picture, relaying the groundwork. Andrea, thank you for your expertise. Thank you for digging in on this. And Colin, thank you for all the work you've done. I can't wait to see what you're doing next. And I'm Heather from Palo Alto. Thanks you guys so much. Take care.
Thank you, everybody.